Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today for ICA's webinar on ICANN's proposed new domain name transfer policy. My name is Camila Sekowitz. I am ICA's Executive Director. And with me here today is Zak Muscovitch, ICA's General Counsel, who will be moderating today's discussion. First of all, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our panelists. All of you are involved with ICANN's Transfer Policy Working Group, and we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experience and knowledge on the topic. I'll start with Roger. So Roger Carney is the Director of Global Policy at GoDaddy. GoDaddy, of course, being a longtime ICA member. Roger participates in ICANN's policy-making process, and he was the chair of the Transfer Policy Working Group. Next, we have Owen Smigelski, who's the head of compliance, head of ICANN Compliance and Relations at Namecheap. And Owen, before his position at Namecheap, was the director of contractual compliance at ICANN. Next, we have Jothan Frakes. Jothan is also an ICA member, and he has been involved with many different sectors of the ICANN world, registrar, registry, new GTLDs. Fun fact about Jothan is that he co-founded a couple of domain name conferences. And next, we have Theo Geurts. He's the Compliance and Policy Officer at Realtime Register B.V. He has extensive experience in the domain name industry and is actively involved in combating cybercrime and DNS abuse. Thank you so much again for being here. And of course, I can't forget our moderator, Zak Muscovitch, who's been ICA's general counsel for, I believe, 6 years at this point. He's also very heavily involved in the ICANN policy world and is also a domain name attorney. So I'll hand it over to Zak. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Camila, and thank you, Theo, Roger, Jothan, and Owen. I'm so pleased to see we have 50 participants today, and that really demonstrates an interest in the transfer policy. Just to put this in context, and Roger is the chair of the working group. In February, the working group submitted its 163-page report with 47 policy recommendations. It took them 3.5 years. I know this because I was part of it. I was involved in these weekly meetings. And so I've often heard Theo, Roger, and Jothan Owen speak more than some of my family members on a regular basis. I won't beat around the bush. It's a complicated area. What I hope for the audience to glean from this session is a good overall understanding of the policy changes that are coming. And we've talked about it as proposed policy changes because right now they've been approved by the GNSO, but they're awaiting approval of the board, and that's what triggers them to actually be policies. And so many of you are familiar with the transfer policy to one degree or another, or are practically familiar with it in the sense of having to transfer domain names. And really, you would have to read the whole 163-page report to understand all that it's done. So, but we can't do that, and we can't cover everything. So we're going to try to focus on the most practical and significant changes as best we can today, so you could get a pretty good understanding and save you the trouble of having to read the entire report, although we encourage you to do so. And so maybe I'll start with you, Roger. Tell us where things are at in terms of the current status, which I just mentioned, and talk about the process the working group took to get us to this point.
Thanks, Zach. Yeah. Again, Roger Carney. Yeah, it's right now you hit on it pretty good there, Zach. We're waiting for the board to pick this up, which should be in the next meeting or two, board meetings, to see if we can get their approval. Again, 47 recommendations, as Zach mentioned, so we got full consensus from the working group and full support from council. So I expect the board to easily pass this as well. And as once the board does that, they'll inform staff to create an IRT, an implementation review team. And I suspect sometime later this year, it'll get started. And I'm assuming a lot of the people that participate in the PDP will participate in the IRT. This PDP was a little more, I don't know, maybe a little more technical, a little more nuanced than a lot of PDPs. So I expect a lot of those subject matter experts to continue on and get this working. So I would be surprised if it takes less than a year for the IRT to complete its work. So realistically, I don't think that, we're looking at these recommendations coming into effect until late 2026 at the earliest. So just so people have a good time frame on that.
Okay, so I just want to mention PDP for those who aren't in the
Sorry.
ICANN world, policy development process, IRT, implementation review team. That's the team that takes over after the policy recommendations to actually put them into practice, to implement them. And so, I mentioned this when a working group went on for 3.5 years, but Theo, I think you were around even before the first transfer policy went into effect. Is that correct? You were involved in that?
No, I think
No?
you have to go back like 2 decades. I mean, at a certain point,
Yeah.
the ICANN community asked themselves the question, should we transfer a domain? Should it be transferable? And the answer was yes. And that also had the implication, like if you can transfer it, you can also steal a domain name. And that sort of started to build up to the point that I sort of got involved. And this was around 2009, 2010. There was a lot of domain theft back then. I mean, and I can't say it out loud now. Back then I couldn't, but basically you just looked up the domain name through the whois, then you get yourself the registered email address, which is usually the login for the username at the registrar control panel. And then you jumped on Facebook and started like, does this guy have a wife, dog, kids? Oh, he's got a dog called Barkley. Okay, Barkley. Okay, I'm in and I can steal the domain name. And that started to accumulate around 2009. And this is where the TNSO Council said, we need to revamp the entire transfer process. So they started a four-phased approach. And they came up with a whole bunch of stuff back then because the transfer policy was really old and needed a revamp. So in 2016, they released a new transfer policy, including something called the change of registrant policy. And this was sort of the idea, now we can stop domain theft here. It didn't work. When the policy was released, the registrars were up in arms because it was an operational nightmare. There was even one piece of the recommendations, we couldn't code it. Our programmers couldn't code it. So that was a problem. And what we discovered also that our support lines, our support staff, they got a ton of questions from confused registrants who just wanted to transfer a domain name, and they ran into all kinds of problems. And as we found out as a working group, ICANN itself, the ICANN organization, they got a ton of complaints. So it wasn't, that part really stuck out like something in the community's mind, like, okay, we need to do something with this later on. And then in 2018, GDPR kicked in and basically it rendered the incoming FOA. We got 2 FOAs always. We used to have them. But
And
the
FOA means, just so everyone can
form of
follow.
authorization.
Right, okay.
And basically, the gaining registrar couldn't get the data anymore from the losing registrar to send that one email. So basically, we operated for a bunch of years without it. And then 4 years ago, the ICANN GNSO Council decided, like, okay, let's get the band back together and let's start this process. And this is where we are today.
Okay, that's a great historical context. Just a couple contextual questions before we get into the meat of the changes. And so, Jothan, can you tell us a little bit about the makeup of the working group? Because ICANN uses a unique multi-stakeholder model for these policy development processes. Tell us a little bit of background about that.
Sure. And thanks, Zach, for leading this. Well, first off, this is for registrars, and then, Zach, you're from the business constituency, and there's many of the ICA members who are from the business constituency, but there are other groups that are represented throughout ICANN. It's called the multi-stakeholder model, MSM, and that means there are people who are, in the business constituency. There are people who are there from the intellectual property constituency, non-commercial users, ISPs. There's a very large and diverse community of people that are represented there. The representation was significant in the registrar population because of the dramatic impact that this policy would have on our businesses. In order to ensure that we could carry forth, whatever changes might happen and provide input, because it's been so baked in for so very long. But that's a very high level view of the multi-stakeholder model. It's designed to be very representative and to bring in, all kinds of diverse opinions.
Okay, thank you.
I think Roger can tell you about trying to contain that and try to bottle that air. But that's hopefully a good enough description.
Thank you. Yeah, I know, for example, I attended as a representative of the BC along with another BC member, Aaronola Akinyemi, who's here with us today. And so, Owen, let me maybe ask you about, broadly speaking, what are the problems chiefly that this working group and its final report attempted to address in broad strokes? I know there's many of them, 47 policy recommendations, but was there problems that were primarily trying to be solved here?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Yeah, I know we talked about the length of the report. The recommendation summary it covers 65 pages. I know because I went through that this morning just to check to make sure. And the one that really I'd like to highlight first is the removal of the gaining FOA form of authorization. I know Theo touched on that. When the GDPR and ICANN's temporary specification came in, registrars could no longer look up email addresses, and also there's some concerns about processing that data for somebody who may not have a relationship with, and so registrars could not send the required gaining FOA, and I, along with some other registrars, really led a push to kind of get an ICANN deferral on this, and they wouldn't do that until there was a transfer policy review. And so what we decided to do is then also take a holistic look at the whole entire transfer policy and see what else is there that we can fix. As long as we're going to tinker with it, let's do see what we can improve. So some of the things that I highlighted here, and some of which may be of interest to participants in this call, is any of the locks associated with the 60-day lock. Those have all been changed to 30 days. Technically 720 hours. I will refer to some of them in days, but the transfer policy refers to all of them now as hours there. And also the inter-registrar transfer lock, registrants can request the registrar to remove that, so that there's that nice feature there, because I know that's a common grumpiness with registrants there. It's not required that a registrar does that, but there is that option to remove just that lock. One thing also we did was the info code, or whatever. There's a whole bunch of different names that it goes by. It is now known as the transfer. Oh, it's the TAC. Goodness, transfer authorization code. I think that's what that acronym stands for. So we'll be talking about the TAC, and that is a lot more secure than it was in the past. It's now a one-time use. It's generated when accessed, as opposed to now where it's generated when the domain is created often. It also has a time to live, a TTL, so that it won't can't be out there and used for a long time. And also a registrar can set it to null if it's, say, for example, there's been a breach to a registrant's account or something like that. So there can be a lot more security built out. And there's also some highly technical security requirements, which me as a lawyer, I can't pretend to understand, but there's things in there to make the TAC a bit more secure. Some other changes include allowing the registrar to do communications via other secure methods, not via just email. I know right now it's all email, but in the future it could be via app or SMS or other secure method as well too. So that'll make a much better user experience for registrants. The change of registrant, also known as COR or CORE, is now becoming the CORD, change of registrant data, because we wanted to make sure that, because the process could apply to if you need to update your physical address, that could trigger this COR. So it also is being recommended that it move out of the transfer policy because it's not really part of transfer, because if a registrant wants to update their data, they should be able to do that. There's going to be some mandatory notifications with the change with the cord, and that wonderful 60-day lock that was there is now gone. So that'll come down later, but yes, that'll be a nice thing, because I know, having worked at ICANN Compliance, when the change of registrant was implemented, that was quite a headache for pretty much everyone involved.
Okay.
Two more quick things here. Is this something that registrants might not necessarily see, but the TAC, the Transfer Emergency Authorization, or it's basically a transfer emergency contact. It's how registrars resolve unauthorized transfers. There's some tinkering with the time limits on that to make it easier for registrars to respond, but also requires cooperation and collaboration over time to make sure that those issues are resolved. And finally, we recommended that there be a transfer dispute policy potential for registrants, so they could dispute compromised or stolen domain names. It was outside of the scope of our PDP. We couldn't do that, and it's going to take a lot of work. But we recommended that ICANN take a look at that so that registrants could have a way, to dispute unauthorized transfers.
Well, thank you. And that's a lot of items. I want to try to focus on a few of them now, drill down deeper on some of them. But that's a terrific survey. I think you covered the breadth of the report remarkably. Luckily this will be on replay for everyone as well. But Roger, let me go to you. Let's maybe look at this like from a before and after perspective on what are colloquially referred to as locks by many. And so let's start at the first one. Where are things at now in terms of a lock, and feel free to use other terminology instead of that word, upon registration, and where are things going based upon the recommendations?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. Yeah, and yeah, the lock is an interesting term because today's policy sort of tries to define it. In the upcoming policy, we've left that more open so that the lock is more up to the registrar, however they want to handle that. And today's they do talk about specifically, client holds and things like that. But yeah, to your point, in today's world, there's really a couple, I would say three now, places where a transfer can be stopped according to a lock. The first one at initial registration. Some registries, not all, but some registries had a up to 60-day lock that you couldn't transfer a new domain once it was registered. Again, that was not standard. It was written into contracts. It was not even policy. Policy just mentioned it because it was in contracts.
In fact, I remember when that came up for discussion, we actually had to go back and look to see where it came from, that initial registration 60-day lock, right? And it was hard written into some registry agreements, but not across the board, as you mentioned. And so the idea behind it was originally what, and why has it now changed?
Yeah, and I think it was, like you said, it was in registry agreements, and I think the registries were trying to help registrars back in the day where getting money may have taken a little more time or however. So it was that buffer zone of making sure the registrar got whole before the credit card fraud or whatever happens, when someone buys something. So I think the registries were trying to help the registrars there. And moving forward, our hope is a 30-day standard lock across all registries. Again, not to expand on that idea. The thought is make it standard so that if a registrant goes to a certain and buys a .com or buys a .horse or whatever, it's the same experience. It's not you get 60 days here or 20 days there or nothing here. We wanted to make that a standard experience for the registrant. So
Right. So that's the first feature, is standardizing across all registries as a consensus policy that, overrides as necessary what's in particular registry agreements. The second facet of it is the reduction from 60 days to 30 days. And why did the working group determine that that was preferable?
yeah, and again, the 60-day, how they came to 60-day, I don't know. Maybe Theo has a little bit of knowledge on that. But the working groups just felt that the 30-day, again, especially on new registrations, the 30-day was ample time to get things done on their end for processing of payments and things like that, and looking for any frauds or getting contacts updated and everything like that. So I think that the working group thought 60 days was a little too long, way too long. So they backed it down to 30, and I think Owen mentioned it, that the 30-day lock is the lock across new registrations, transfers. It's the same. It's the same number, so no one gets confused on what is it, 30 days here and 60 there, or what is it? It's just 30-day lock whenever a new registration comes through or a transfer happens.
Okay. Theo, can I ask you, what would you say the main justification for having a 30-day post initial registration lock is, as opposed to 0, for example, or as opposed to 60 days, for example?
Yeah, well, just to circle back on what Roger just mentioned, where did it actually came from? I can't tell you. I have no idea. I mean, it goes back so long. I mean, you need to be really one of the sort of people that's just started ICANN back in 1998. And, you know, and this is a bit tricky when you talk about the periods of the locks, and when you talk about policy making. You suddenly, as a working group member, you are confronted with a 60-day lock, and everybody has an opinion about it. So you start to justify why we need a 60-day lock, and then others begin to sort of, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have a lock. I mean, I was one of the people who said, like, well, I don't like any periods of locks. If somebody wants to set a lock to the domain name, it should be the registrant. Leave it up to them. If they want to have a lock, fine. If they don't want to have a lock, also fine. So and you go through this process, and as and everybody on the call here from the working group, it's consensus policy. So you start to discuss it, and you need to end up somewhere. And we then ended up with the lock periods, which are now in the recommendations. So that's sort of how we go about it.
Thank you, Theo. Jothan or Owen, do you care to add to anything about the initial 30-day registration lock changes?
For me, Namecheap, our position was we didn't want any locks at all. But as that was a minority position, we had to obviously go along with there. But I did push, pretty hard for the way to opt out for the inter-registrar transfer. I understand the concerns with, that initial period, payment concerns and whatnot. But that was one of the things I worked towards for that, make that option to remove it, where a registrant can contact the registrar, and under some certain conditions, the registrar can waive that. As I put in the chat, we want to make sure that if you're making an aftermarket purchase or a domain portfolio, whether it's an investor or a company, they can do that. So it's specifically called out in there. And I know, Zach, you and I, we actually attended additional meetings outside of the regular transfer policy calls to wordsmith and work on that. So yeah, they're actually, even though we're meeting weekly, Zach and I were also meeting more than that too at some points to work on that wording there. So yeah, that was one thing that was really important for me, was to be able to get that inter-registrar lock opt out in there.
Okay, and let's get into that more in detail momentarily. Jothan, do you have anything you want to add about the 60-day initial registration lock that's now going to be a 30-day initial registration lock?
Well, I think it was for a different time. I think, we've discovered, we just sort of, picked a time when the 60 was set. And I think, given that we've discovered, the general use, this is a great, I think a good reduction, plus the consistency that we're introducing. It seems like a good balance to make it more predictable, easy to remember. I think we came up with a good balance. I mean, there's no perfect. And so, often we were choosing from the least awful options to kind of find some kind of what I call the most possible Goldilocks scenario. But it was really more like, I don't know, navigating divorce mediation is the joke I use, that you have satisfaction, or equity and dissatisfaction equals success, right? That if everybody is, equally dissatisfied with it, you've come somewhere beneficial. And because there's all the diverse interests that I described, and all of their perspectives are very important to them, we had to try and really weigh that in. And I think,
Right.
Roger, I want to pay you a compliment, as the chair of this group, that was really difficult to navigate that. I know that, there was a lot of minority positions that we spent a lot of time on to listen to and kind of, go through those ideas. So
Right.
it's I know it was difficult to navigate, but I think we ended up with a good balance with the 30 days.
Thank you, Jonathan. Roger, just still on the 60-day lock before we move to change of registrant data. I recall, there's some people, and Owen mentioned this was Namecheap's minority position, but there were others that wanted zero post initial registration lock, but there are others that felt that there should still be the 60-day lock, and felt strongly that there should be a 30-day lock. And I think I recall some of the arguments that were made for maintaining a lock, at least 30 days, possibly 60, was one, for brand owners, trademark enforcement teams who identify a possible cyber squad infringing domain name, they want to be able to chase it at a single registrar. Of course, once they commence the UDRP, it gets locked at that registrar, but before that period. And the other argument, do you recall what some of the other arguments were? There was another one, that there really isn't any reason for someone who goes and registers a domain name newly at a registrar that they ostensibly picked to want to change registrars within the first 30 days anyhow, right? Like if you go to GoDaddy or you go to Namecheap and you say, okay, well, I've selected this registrar, it should be a good decision for at least 30 days. That's part of at least the thinking or the argument that went into it as well.
Sure, yeah. And again, I think, Theo actually touched on it real quick. Previously, there used to be a lot more, maybe it was easier to maybe steal domain names, as Theo mentioned. And I think that we recognize that too, that registrars have put in place more security measures to not, allow that. And I think that afforded us to, decrease that time period down quite a bit. But there's a lot of business decisions that go into that. If a registrar is running a special and they're selling comms for $10 or whatever, they don't want them. They want the customer to stick around and do business with them. They don't want them to jump over to another registrar that's doing a special on renewals or whatever. So it's one of those where it'll allow that customer to spend some time with the registrar and get to the business together there. So.
Right. So, okay, so it looks like after everything was taken into consideration, a consensus was found for the 30-day post initial registration lock. And then now I want to circle back to something that Owen just raised, which was the change of registrant data. What is the situation today, Owen, in terms of a lock with change of registration data? And what will be the situation tomorrow, so to speak, after the consensus policies are, as anticipated, going into effect?
Yeah, so the change of registrant as it is today, actually, as what was originally intended, was any change to basically any material change to registrant data, name, email, postal address, telephone number would require a lock, and basically material meant anything. We couldn't really figure out what a non-material change was. And that also, when originally created, meant enabling and disabling a privacy or proxy provider would trigger a 60-day lock. So ICANN initially did a kind of an exemption for that when it first came out, because that was obviously problematic. But moving forward, it also implemented a 60-day lock. There could be an option to opt out of that 60-day lock for change of registration, registrant data, but moving forward in the future, that won't be there. So you can still update contact information, stuff like that as needed. There will be mandatory notifications, which I think are optional for some of those changes now. And also, if you say change the data on 500 domains instead of getting 500 emails, that can be batched into one email that says this change applies to the following domain names. So it'll be a little bit easier, smoother process. And also, when you update your contact data, it won't lock your domain name for 60 days.
Right. Jothan, just give us like a practical scenario from a registrant's perspective, perhaps, about how this change may help them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tried to make sure and bake in agency into this so that the registrant, doesn't get a surprise, oops, where's my domain situation going on. So there's good security baked into this. And what's balanced with it is, I think as Roger identified, a good lack of friction where it needs to be in order for the commercial activity of the marketplace to really, be there. There are some areas, I think JD in the chat mentioned, somebody who buys a domain, registers it, and within 30 days sells it. It's pretty exceptional. So, that congratulations. But, otherwise, there's a lot of places where you kind of want to have a little bit of some guardrails so that you don't have, strange things happening in the registration process. For example, registrars have to deal often with credit card fraud or fraudulent activity. We want to make sure that, if somebody, transfers the domain away, that it is in fact the appropriate party to transfer that domain name away. And so we wanted to basically ensure there was integrity for the gaining and losing registrant, that the challenges of losing registrars and gaining registrars were possible for us to make sure that the registrant had agency, trust, and security in the domain transfer.
Okay,
and I
thank you.
think we found a good balance, but it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be the least awful of the perfects that were available to us. There was no
Right.
perfect, really.
Right. Theo, I want to just dig a little deeper on the change of registrant situation. So if I'm a registrant, as things stand now, if I change my name or correct a typo in my name, there will be an automatic lock, I understand. And even if I change my email address, there will be a lock. Has to be a balance between transportability and security. And so what did the working group determine was the guardrails, as Jothan put it, for someone who's changing their email address, but there's no lock is triggered by that? Because if I was to change my email address, like let's say I was a hijacker, I instead of Zak@Muscovitch.com, I put it Theo@Geurts.com, then you would get the notifications. You would have a control. So what are the mechanisms that the working group recommended for dealing with that kind of situation?
So before we changed as a working group how the entire process should work, I mean, the old situation was if you wanted to change your email address, that was considered a change of registrant, and that triggered an entire process on what a registrant had to do. But you quickly ran into problems if you were changing an old email address, which was no longer in use anymore for whatever reason, because your internet service provider went bankrupt years ago. You didn't use that one anymore. So you ran into all these technical problems. So what we kind of said, like, okay, what we are going to do is if there are any of these changes on the email address, then there's going to be a notification. So you're going to get a notification that there has been a change. Like in your example, you would get a notification that your email address has been changed. We didn't go into the discussion about the other fields, like what happens if the organization or the first and last name changes. Because then you get into these discussions, is there a change of ownership and is that actually relevant? So what we said as a working group, like, let's not go there. Because we as registrars, we cannot make a determination if a company name changes, that there is a change of registrant. Is there suddenly a new owner? We have no idea. I mean, it could be a different brand that they are using. So we wanted to stay clear from those discussions. So we kept it to a very light notification regime only, to give at least at least a sort of a heads up. Hey, there is a change of the data there. Maybe you want to look at it. Is that going to be a sort of overall solution to everything? No. I mean, if you get compromised as a registrant because your computer has been compromised, all bets are off, and you have much bigger problems than just a change of registrant. But still, again, policy can't fix everything, and this is sort of again a consensus policy where we at least acknowledge, like, let's not have a huge impact on the registrants when they update their data, because that's what they are doing, and let's make sure that there's still some kind of notification for security purposes.
Okay. Roger, and then Owen, and any comments on this, such as, for example, in connection with some of the guardrails or notice requirements or email verification requirements for a change of registered data, which is different than a change of registered data we're talking about.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I think Theo, when he introduced himself earlier, was talking about how, the transfer policy got to be what it is today. In that, the change of registrant was thought to maybe stop some illegal things from happening, and it didn't work out. And it was the biggest pain point for registrars, registrants, ICANN, everyone involved in the process. So the change of registrant was an easy topic to discuss. Not such an easy topic to resolve, but it was easy to discuss because everyone had pain points in it. And we kept the idea of a material change across the board. If if you're changing Bob to Robert, technically that's not a material change, or Bobby with an I or Y, that's not technically a material change. So material change still is in effect going forward. But yeah, it was definitely focused on the registrant name or the organization, and the email, and obviously the email being the key to most of it. So yeah, it was that discussion around that, and again, as Theo described how things happened decade ago, there's more security in registrar systems now, so it wasn't that necessary to follow that path. So notification was obviously something everyone wanted, so that when an email did change, notification was sent. And when an email changes at a registrar, the registrar has to verify that email is actually working. So within 15 days of a change anyway. So it has to verify that it's an actual email address. So we tied that back into this and didn't think that there was any more need for additional measures beyond that. So.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Owen, any final words or observations on this?
Yeah. And I think this change of registrant data, as well as other things that we approached in our discussions, was, we would like to, in a perfect world, fix every single problem related to domain names and stop domain names theft, stopped all these different things. But some of the discussions, we realized we just can't do that. Whatever we come up with, somebody's going to find a way around, or it could be too restrictive or too uncomfortable. So the solutions we looked for, such as in this one, was make it as frictionless, but also not something that can be won't be not noticed. That's why we put the notice requirement in there, which I think is optional for change of registrant now. Now there'll be a mandatory. When there's a change, the notification goes out, and so that would allow the registrant to get the email notification to let them know that there was a change. If they didn't authorize it, then they can contact the registrar and go through that process. So those are some of the things we did, because you can't stop everything bad on the internet, but it's a lot easier if you know about it in order to do that. So again, that was for the change of registrant. But also other things that we came up with in these policy changes as well.
Right. One thing that I'll mention that came up philosophically now and then in the conversations in the working group, and I think I would raise it more often than anyone else, is that at the end of the day, ICANN transfer policy can do its best to prevent thefts and provide security, but there are other mechanisms providing security for domain name registration commercially. There's registry lock services and similar that are available to protect domain names that are wholly outside of the locks provided within the transfer policy. It's just something to consider and be aware of as well. So I want to change gears only slightly to talk about what could be characterized as the third kind of a lock. Perhaps we talked about post initial registration. We talked about change of registrant data, but now actual change of registrant. And so maybe, Roger, we could start with you to tell us about that, and just maybe so everyone can follow along, differentiate between change of registrant data and change of registrant.
So, and yeah, and we had a good discussion on this. Is how does this get determined? What is a change of registrant, or people call it different things. An ownership change, or whatever it is. It's actually changing the hands from one person to another. A change of registrant. And in those circumstances, that's going to be left up to the registrars to make that decision. If it was a change of an account, or change of ownership, a change of registrant, where the working group didn't get into trying to detail that out. They were focused on the change of registrant data, the data itself, and when that changed, what would happen. The change of registrant, as it is going to be left to the registrars to determine that value. So.
Okay, so Theo, tell us how things are now with a change of registrant. Is there a lock today? If I bought a domain name, well, assuming it's not an initial registration. If I bought a domain name and I want to transfer to Jothan, and Jothan as a different registrar than me, could he then transfer to Owen at a different registrar later that day? Take us through the kind of work process and restrictions on this when it comes to a change of registrant.
Okay, so I can't be too detailed on this one because I don't work for a retail registrar. So I don't know how a retail registrar sort of came up with, I don't know how they fix those aftermarket problems. I can only look at the wholesale registrar perspective.
Fair enough.
And what we've said and what I've argued back in 2016, 2015 is, guys, we have an issue there because we don't know what's going on in all these accounts at our resellers. We have no idea what goes on there. So we leave it up to the reseller to make the decision, this is a go or this is a no-go. So how that's playing out at GoDaddy or Namecheap, I don't know.
Okay, so Owen, let's go to you. You're a Namecheap retail registrar. Are things going to get better for registrants in terms of changes of registrant or not?
Yeah, I would expect so. That's going to happen. And I more work on the policy side as opposed to the operation side. So I'm kind of speaking, more broadly and generally. I've been in contact with my team on this, so they're aware of the changes. But yeah, you'll be able to make those modifications and changes. Potentially this could apply, moving domain names between accounts and things like that. There will be email notifications, like I said before, but there's not going to be any types of locks or anything like that, which I know, having worked at ICANN Compliance, was a really big pain for people because they would want to transfer a domain name. They would find out that their email address was incorrect or an old one or something you don't have access to, and they would try and update it, and then they were locked in for 60 days, which obviously is not a very good feature. I understand the desire to want to prevent hijacking and stuff like that, which is a common way. They hack an account, they change the email address, transfer the domain name out, but that was causing a lot more pain than it was trying to than the problem it was trying to solve. So yeah, I think moving forward will be a lot easier and a lot less registrant frustration with these kinds of things.
So Jothan, Owen just mentioned one difficulty that's been overcome because the change of registrant data, if you change one thing, that could trigger a lock and prevent you from being able to sell the name or transfer it on for a period of time. But the other aspect of this is the registrar hops from one to the other, let's say from registrar A to registrar B, no lock, registrar B to registrar C, lock.
Sure.
Tell us about that and the security implications of it, and how and why the working group determined that there should still be a 30-day lock on that second hop.
Yeah, well, the important piece here is when a registrar loses the domain, when the registrar no longer has possession of that domain, they are really impaired in their ability to help rectify a situation where there's a problematic situation with a transfer. And those happen not too often, but when they happen, they really happen. And the challenge there is once it's gone to another registrar, quite often we have an ability to work that out amongst each other and do some sort of restoration. However, once it hops again, it gets so much more complex. And so, putting these locks in place is a reasonable kind of guardrail to help shelter that. It doesn't like the 60-day covered at least a billing period of a credit card when somebody would say, hey, what's this? And you're able to look under the hood and find there's some fraud or some activity and discover that these domains have been moved or something bad has happened. But the lock is really sort of just a safety guard for those things. And it was a difficult balance to strike. 30 days can be forever. Again, I mentioned JD's wonderful luck with selling something within the first 30 days. Congratulations. That's not the norm that I've experienced. And, the 30 days is usually enough time for something to work itself out. I was more focused on the change of registrant. Honestly, I love AI, it's great and everything, but my name gets auto-corrected to Jothan all the time. And in fact, as I submit a form, and I have to go back through and fix my name very frequently. And, the 60-day lock was just confounding me. So 30 days to me seems, so much better. And the ability now with some changes not being material, that may or may not be considered material by your registrar, but a change of email or phone number to make sure that you're contactable would absolutely be material. And so we want to make sure when these domains move that there's notice happening as well as those locks and things.
Roger, it sounds almost, thank you, Jothan. Roger, it sounds almost like the fact that the working group recommended that we could get rid of the locks that are triggered by change of registrant data was possible by maintaining the 30-day lock on the second registrar hop. It's almost like that's the security fence around it. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the considerations that went into deciding that you wanted to keep a 30-day lock and change it, and why there was this whole opt-out situation in existence too about
Yeah.
these things.
Yeah, and you're right, Zach. There was a lot of when you look at the recommendations, 28 of them really do with transfers and specific to registrant transfers and everything. And then the other 19 are based on other ideas, the TAC, the transfer dispute, and bigger transfers. But those original 28 are really tied together. So you're right, Zach. The group came back to things that they did a year ago and said, hey, we added this security feature, so that affords us to do this. And to your point, that 30-day lock and the ability to change that from a 60-day to nothing, for a change of registrant data, is in those security features that were added throughout the process. So it's not just one of those things. There's 13 different security features that were changed or whatever it was. And those added up to, okay, then if a registrant's coming in and changing their data, then it's covered elsewhere about, if it's going to get stolen or not. That's going to be handled elsewhere. And as you mentioned, and as the last few people have talked about, is once that leaves a registrar and goes to a different registrar, there is a lock. So and as Jothan pointed out, that's when it starts to get tricky. If it's still at the same registrar, that registrar has a lot of latitude in what they can do. So if it was, someone hijacking it and they kept it at the same registrar, and the registrar could, account for that and correct that. But it's when that jumps, and then obviously that's why that 30-day lock came in.
Well, that's a great segue to what I think is probably going to be the last topic that we are able to cover, unfortunately, because there's a lot more. I mean, there's the whole set of bulk transfer recommendations and change the form of authorization. There's a lot we could talk about, but the last one I think we'll be able to adequately cover before maybe we could deal with a handful of questions at the end, has to do with what happens when there is a dispute, an unauthorized transfer of a domain name. And it's something that I bring up repeatedly in the group, that listen, like, there's a transfer dispute resolution policy in existence today. This is different than the uniform domain name dispute resolution policy. That's between trademark owners and registrants. The transfer dispute resolution policy is an actual standalone set procedure, just like the UDRP, that enables a registrar to commence a dispute to recover a domain name from another registrar that the domain name went to without authorization. And it's important for us to also bear in mind contextually that most of these situations with unauthorized transfers are resolved informally by registrars dealing one-on-one with their fellow registrars. But so out of we looked at how many of these transfer disputes actually occurred. I think it was 5 or something like that in like the 20-year history of it, or something, whatever the number was, 15 years. A handful of them. So really, it's not the solution that's commonly used to deal with these things. But the point that I would make is that this is a procedure that the registrar must initiate. And so, Theo, I don't know if you remember some of these discussions. I know your background is the wholesale registrar, but maybe you could just say a few words about what the interest was to, and what the recommendation was about the transfer dispute resolution policy.
Well, as you mentioned it yourself, I mean, when we back in 2016, a little bit before that, we came up with that process, because we felt like, okay, there needs to be some kind of solution there when there's a domain name that has been stolen. And we sort of we looked very closely back then to the UDRP process, the Uniform Dispute Resolution. And as you mentioned, the amount is very, very low. Now, there's a couple of reasons for it. One of the reasons is most likely there is not much domain theft, because the entire landscape of registrars has changed. I mean, if I look at our resellers, domain investors, they all use two-factor authentication, IP whitelisting, and God knows what they can use there. So,
and I think some people pointed to GDPR as also playing a role in this.
yeah, sure.
Well.
I mean, if you talk to registrars directly, they would acknowledge, like, yeah, GDPR came and the amounts plummet, but what was left of it. So, but there's also maybe the problem that the dispute resolution that the policy has costs money. So if you lose it, it's going to cost you money, and that is, of course, you need to be 100% certain in those cases if you're going to start it. So that is a little bit problematic also. Is it a very good piece of policy? It is still complicated, and I think where we ended up with was pretty good as far as you can go. I mean, these things, again, if you encounter domain name theft, it is not something, even when we try to solve it informally, it is a long process most of the time. You need a lot of evidence, you need a lot of communication. So these things take their time, and that still remain problematic all across the board when domain name theft happens. The resolution, the policy that we have there, it is okay, but policy can't fix everything here. That is the bottom line when it comes to these cases.
Thank you, Theo. Jothan, give us an idea of what the reasons were for the policy recommendation about GNSO investigating the possibility of a registrant initiable dispute resolution procedure?
Well, I would say, we listened. And, right now, as was described, there's a very infrequently used transfer dispute policy that's initiated by the registrar. It's pricey. It's
And you have to
not
convince the
perfect.
registrar to initiate it, right?
Yeah, and it takes the registrar must
yeah,
initiate it. So you're
right.
typically doing that on behalf of your customer. I'll tell you, we because that is such a, I'll use the word fugly. I don't know if it's a technical term, but it's essentially a difficult and arduous process. So it's not often used. And the registrars have come up with typically something they'll work out amongst each other, where an account is created and pushed internally at the gaining registrar, so that the registrant can then recover the name. But it often doesn't ever get back to the losing registrar. So anyway, we spent a lot of time, and I really credit a lot of the registrars here and your hard work as the ICA to ensure that registrants have as much agency as possible in this whole transfer process. And it's not always perfect. And when it's not perfect, that perhaps it might be worth looking at a registrant being able to initiate a transfer dispute. The challenge with that is that there's things like expired domain policy and how redemption policy works, that folks will sometimes see a domain is no longer at their registrar and complain somebody transferred it away, rather than, oh gosh, I didn't pay my bill. And that happens far more often than you would think, that either the domain got sold by the registrar because the registrant didn't renew, or maybe it got re-registered by another party. And those are new registrants at that point. So there's got to be a sort of a picket fence between when it is in fact actually something that is a transfer dispute and those other policies. And we just looked at it and said, this is going to be too complicated to deal with in this. We're already, let's make that suggestion for future work,
Right.
because we already have so much going on.
And so I think the ultimate recommendation is the working group recommends that a registrant initiable transfer dispute resolution policy be looked at as for future work. And so, Roger, you were the chair. I think you got a toast at the last ICANN meeting for your 3.5 years of work. Well deserved. I wish we could do more for you here today, and all of you, Theo, Jothan, Owen, just to have such knowledgeable people who participate for such a lengthy period of time in what you can see are intricate and complex considerations. I can't thank you enough for sharing it with us today. I know that there's a lot of questions and comments, didn't even have a moment to look at in the chat, but I'm sure they were all worthy of further discussion. We'd love to have you back again one day. I'll throw it back to you, Camila. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Really appreciate you taking the time speaking to us today. And thank you to everybody for joining us. Take care, everyone.